What's up, y'all, and welcome to the Idea Space. I'm Yancey Strickler. In this episode of the Idea Space, we have a special roundtable, gathering together 12 experts on the field of measurement from a wide variety of perspectives. Among this group, we have a Pew Research methodologist, a rabbi, a Tlingit tribal leader, an Islamic scholar, an entrepreneur, a sociologist, a law professor, a journalist, an investor, and a BBC researcher. And together, they're discussing 5 questions about what kinds of values we measure, who decides what gets measured, what is the impact of being measured. This roundtable is the second in a series of 4 events that are taking place this year, all exploring a theme that I call Data is Fire. These conversations are exploring philosophical, social, and technological frontiers of value and measurement with people who are doing the work, who have experience in these spaces. The goal of these conversations is to generate public knowledge, clear ideas that draw from a variety of experiences, and if we're lucky, maybe we spark some new ideas or find some new language that's helpful. That would be success. But the main goal is just to create public knowledge together. Let me just set the scene for just a moment. So if I think about data as fire, imagine an early human's relationship to fire. How did they even discover it in the first place? Maybe it was a lightning strike, some kind of brush fire. Think about how terrifying that probably was. Now imagine the first moment the human was able to be near a fire without being burned by it. They can learn that you could be warmed by a fire, that you could feel its embrace. Who knows how that first happened? Probably some pretty gnarly trial and error to get there. But so after someone discovered that fire could keep you warm, someone else figured out how you could have a campfire without that fire spreading. And sometime after that, we don't know how long, someone else figured out that you could cook food over a fire. And suddenly humans were eating more complicated things with more calories, and our brains started to develop differently. We became intelligent. Who Homo sapiens were began to significantly shift forever. And many generations later, humans learned that we could use fire to melt things, shape things, make tools, make weapons. We learned how to use fire and heat to create steam and the internal combustion engine. We learned how to manage energy and heat, creating the atomic, nuclear, and battery ages. And this is how far fire has taken us. So I think of this long process as humans taming fire. This is learning how to harness its strengths without being injured by its dangers. And it took almost all of human existence until now to get there. So probably like you, I look back at those early humans with like a kind of primitive pity. Look at how simple they were, how little they knew. But of course, they managed to survive and reproduce in a world where we almost certainly would have died. And I think that we also face a strikingly similar situation today. In our case, it's not literally fire, it's data that we face this same dilemma with. So data has been around forever, but only in forms that we could easily count. Jesus had 12 disciples and fed 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Is that really true, or is that like a sampling error that day? Because of the work of counting in general, we've tended to count money, things that could be worth money, or things that we needed for survival. Counting took energy, so we counted what was most important. After the Enlightenment, and especially the development of the scientific method, what got counted really changed, as did the importance of data. And this led to what I think of as one of the first major innovations in taming data, which is the creation of the data table in the early 19th century. It's a way that we could easily scan and compare multiple sources, multiple ideas at the same time. This was the first communal campfire. And just in time, because the 19th and 20th centuries saw huge rises in the amount of data. First from scientific research, mass media, industrialization, now digital technology, data was everywhere. But in terms of data, the 21st century is a whole different ballgame. As Martin Gurry writes in the book, The Revolt of the Public, a study by researchers at Berkeley in 2002 measured in data bits the amount of information that had been produced in the years 2001 and 2002, comparing them to earlier times. More information was generated in 2001 than in all the previous existence of our species on Earth. And 2001 doubled all information in human history before that, In 2002, doubled what 2001 had done, and that has only increased. So at first we reacted to this new resource as a kind of a toy. Look at all the things that we could do, all the cool stuff. We use data to personalize experiences, to find friends, to connect things. This is when we still said the word big data with some kind of awe. But everything that's happened in the years since has crushed that honeymoon. From Edward Snowden to Cambridge Analytica, to the Equifax hack, to the local news scaring you about getting your identity stolen, to Facebook, all of these things have taught us to be fearful of data. And this data honeymoon has become more of a nightmare. And this is where we find ourselves today, with a real low point of trust in institutions, and a lot of elite ideas, and a great suspicion of data. And I think what people rightly understand about data that people in charge do not is that whoever is measuring generally has self-interested reasons to do so. With the exception of the census, maybe some public polling, you generally aren't measured for your own good. You're measured for reasons of control or optimization, so people can change your opinion or do something with it. People distrust measurement because they know it's not helping them, it's helping someone else. In many chain stores, you'll find cameras that are trained on the cashiers, on the registers. This isn't to stop the store from being robbed by someone coming in, it's actually to stop the employee from taking money from the employer. And yet there are no cameras trained on the corner executive's office, although the level of criminal impact there is probably much greater potentially. But here we see that data and measurement can be forms of control. And what's different about now versus other periods of human history is that most measurement is implicit. Some of the people here on our panel work in surveys, things where you have to ask people questions. But for the sort of data tools and technologies that are running our lives now, they're just sensing what we're doing. It's just, we take action and they passively know these actions that we're taking. It really changes our relationship to data. So I think of all of this and where we are now as something like that first early humans torch. You know, you put fire on a thing and it helps you see. And I think that's about the level where we are now. But the level of nuance that we have for heat, for fire, forging, melting, singeing, all these things, that's the kind of nuance we're going to need to learn with data. So this is the second conversation we've had. And in our last conversation, we learned some things that I think can help us set the stage for where we are today. In our previous conversation, we talked about what to measure and what not to measure. And we talked about this shift between value and values, the way the world had previously been ruled by moral values and now is more ruled by economic values, numeric values, things that we can measure. And one of the key projects that we're facing now is that what gets defined as a metric, as a value that we all share, is really changing. It had been just financial value has been our main peg. And today we're seeing a lot of different types of values, different types of things that we can measure are increasingly being defined mathematically. They're being defined by systems. They're being used to distribute goods or access. Examples of this, we're seeing CO2 emissions, carbon labels, carbon footprint, showing up on shampoo bottles. Adele distributing concert tickets using loyalty algorithms. But in our last conversation, we identified some of the ways that these changes are challenging and problematic. And I just want to call out 3 of those learnings I took from our last conversation. The first is if we think about taming data, measuring human values and morals is incredibly hard. It gets into language and everyone's language is different. Trying to define some universal idea is very challenging. It's not that it's impossible, but it's going to be very difficult. The second thing is that motivated people can easily overestimate and oversell what we're capable of measuring. In general, you find the more someone works in data, the more skeptical they are. The less someone works in it, the more they believe it can do all kinds of things, especially scary things. It's very easy to scare people. So there's a chasm here to get across. And finally, getting these things right takes a lot of time and especially takes cross-disciplinary collaboration. From our previous panel, which had a very diverse set of experiences, we really saw how all of us coming from different places helped us arrive at some clear ideas. But that work takes time and it's boring. So those are things that people don't tend to prioritize. But I think those things are key for really doing this stuff the right way. But to manage where we are from here, we're gonna have to learn from our ancestors who learned how to harness fire, turning into a tool that wouldn't kill us, wouldn't overwhelm us, but that we could use for our own ends. And that has taken pretty much all of human history until now to get there. And this is now where we are with data. So this is the conversation we're going to talk about today. Now, first, I'd love to just introduce our roundtable. So first, we have alphabetically, we have Ashley Amaya. Hi, Ashley. Ashley is a senior survey methodologist at Pew Research Center. In this role, she serves as an advisor for projects involving address-based sampling, multiple modes of data collection, and surveys of rare populations. Amaya's work on address-based sampling methods, web panel surveys, and the use of alternative data sources to replace and enhance survey data has been published in a lot of great journals. Prior to joining Pew Research, she was a senior survey methodologist at RTI International, where she led research into address-based sampling methods and applications. Welcome, welcome, Ashley. Next, we have Shannon Arvizu, Ph.D. Hi, Shannon. Shannon's a sociologist and founder at Epic Teams, an organizational performance consultancy. And Shannon is currently working on an initiative called the Citizen Dashboard to help governments measure and improve citizen outcomes. Next, we have Esther Dyson. Hi, Esther. Esther is a tech journalist, investor, and executive director of Wellville. Esther is also, if I remember correctly, a board member at 23andMe, which might be an interesting thing to talk about today. We have Morgan Howard. Hi, Morgan. Morgan is from the Tlingit Nation, Eagle Moiety, Taikwiti Clan, Brown Bear House. Born and raised in Alaska, his early childhood took place in the small village of Yakutat. He is the founder of Morgan Howard Productions, a video production and communications firm, and he specializes in communicating for Alaska Natives and American Indians. He has extensive knowledge in issues affecting Alaska Native corporations and tribal businesses. This includes the history of these indigenous groups and the laws that affect them. In Alaska, Native corporations are unique entities created by the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and he currently serves on the board of directors for Sealaska Corporation. Lianne Kerlin. Hi, Lianne. Lianne is a senior researcher at the BBC, trained in psychology and human-computer interaction. She's currently leading a multi-year project at the BBC that seeks to identify and measure core human values. Irwin Kula. Hi, Irwin. Is a rabbi, author, director of the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership, and the co-founder of the Disruptor Awards with Clayton Christensen and the Tribeca Film Festival. I mentioned that because I also got one of those. I got one of those Tribeca Disruptive Awards, which is a red hammer. Among Irwin's projects is something I'm interested to talk about today, which is the Flourishing Project, which introduces character strengths and positive psychology to congregations and measures the results. Fascinating. Pauline Pigott, hi Pauline, is a senior consultant and chief of staff to the managing partner at Deloitte Sustainability France, where she specializes in the sustainable transformation of large corporations. She helps companies develop sustainability and social innovations programs to effectively mitigate the environmental and social impacts of climate change. Prior to Deloitte, Pauline worked at the French Ministry of Environment on circular economy policies. Next, we have Übeyd Ruff. Hi, Übeyd. Übeyd is a technology transfer officer at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University and a research fellow and editor at the geopolitical think tank, the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. He holds a doctorate in law from Creighton and is a licensed attorney, certified fraud examiner, and certified Islamic finance executive with experience in anti-money laundering, business management, forensic auditing, and financial fraud prevention. He was in-house counsel and urgent claims analyst for a Fortune 500 financial services company. And he's also a policy advisor for the Islamic Reporting Initiative, an award-winning NGO that promotes corporate sustainability and social responsibility based on Islamic values. Very excited to talk about that. We have Salome Viljoen. Hi, Salome. Salome is an NYU postdoc and soon to be Columbia University School of Law academic fellow and lecturer. Salome is especially brilliant on the topic of data governance, introducing a concept called democratic data that we previously talked about in the idea space and we'll talk about here today. Welcome, Salome. We have Alex Varley-Winter. Hi, Alex. Alex is a UK-based investigative journalist with a focus on finance and the climate. And last but not least, we have Marlon Wayne. Marlon has worked to build insights within consumer durables, venture capital, and sales. He is the co-founder of Impulse, a social polling app that dubs itself the Nielsen's for the TikTok generation. But you do not have that phrase on your bingo card for today. Our conversation will focus on 5 questions. We're going to spend between 10 to 15 minutes on each. Welcome to all of you. And so we'll jump in. So the first question is, what values, behavior, and things do we tend to measure, and what don't we? I would love, Esther, you're unmuted. How do you respond to this question of what types of things do we tend to measure, and what types of things don't we tend to?
Okay, I just have to preface, I was on the board of 23andMe, but I no longer am.
Okay.
And it's okay. I'm executive founder of Wellville as opposed to director. So we have a CEO. It's a nonprofit. Rather than answer your question, I just want to pose 2 more really short and then answer the question. I've got to assume there were lots of different humans that discovered fire, just as there are lots of different people who discover data. And I'm curious if anybody's studied chimpanzees and their relation to fire, because we might learn something. The second thing is I've got something in the chat that you can look at later. We tend to measure things. I think we're going more and more towards real-time measurement. And in some ways that's really great. But what it means is we're not measuring the long term. And not only are we not measuring it, we're not thinking about it. And so we tend to be too reactive, whether it's in the stock market or, oh my gosh, my child's score is X, as opposed to, at the end of the year, they got a B+ and the teacher said they tried hard, or, just we're kind of confusing precision with meaning. And I'll be short and leave it at that. There's a lot more to say.
Great. Thank you, Esther. Morgan, looking at Sealaska, there's like a lot of different types of entities within Sealaska: drilling, environmental services, fishery. From your perspective, being on a board, how do you think about what is being measured, or what are those kinds of things that are in your conversations together?
One primary item we're constantly looking at is we're set up to benefit our shareholders, and the Native Corporation is an alternative to the reservation system. So our land is meant to provide benefits. So we are supposed to manage our land to provide benefits for our shareholders, which you could think of as our tribal members. So we're looking at how do we measure whether we're doing a good job, how we're being successful in this, taking this group of people and elevating them and making their lives better. And that's a challenge. And that's a challenge because it really strikes at the heart of what you're going after, which is why I was attracted to Bento, was because of your philosophy around this. And by the way, the questions you're posing today, I really think is really the most important, and maybe more important than the answers we come up with, is just thinking about these questions, because a lot of folks aren't thinking about these questions. It's happening right now, which means that we're going through life constantly measuring and taking those results and making decisions because of it. But not as many people are asking, well, are we measuring the right things? Because we can't help as humans to do that, right? We're constantly evaluating, we're constantly posing questions and looking for results. So I wanted to thank you for that. Just the whole conversation is very worthwhile. I try to think back. I try to think in the ways of my ancestors and use the same thinking that they had, which was with our Tlingit concept of ha-shagun, which is 2 Tlingit words and translates into English the idea that we look equally at both the past, present, and future. So we considered what our ancestors thought of as important, what we think of as important today, to make our decisions for today's population, but also for our children and our grandchildren, and use that in our decision making. So when we make a decision, how does it benefit those 3 groups of people? And that's something that I think about all the time. It's long-term thinking for sure. It's also trying to understand if there's any indigenous wisdom that we can draw upon. And so I've been doing that a lot lately. And I think, when you get down through layers and layers, what you get to is, for us, for meaning is relationships. Our relationships with each other, we're the most important thing. Our connection with each other, our connection with Mother Earth was the most important thing. And try to see if we can start measuring those for success, as opposed to the easy things, which is, by the way, the easy answer to your question is we measure that which is easy.
Yes.
Right. And that which people understand. It's harder for things to resonate when they don't understand them. Right. So we have to, anyways, sometimes there's adding new to get to where you're going. Sometimes there's going back and stripping to get to where you want to go. Thanks.
Thank you, Morgan. Yeah. So to calling from Esther saying, we measure immediate, we struggle to measure long-term. And then I like Morgan is introducing this layer of maybe we go to what's easy, but there is this attempt you are making to, is there other wisdom that we can bring into this context? Because there is a kind of a context of conversation we're having now. I'll open this up for other folks if you want to jump in. I will just direct to Pauline. I'm curious for Pauline, thinking about corporate transformation. Do those metrics, is that a change in metrics? How does measurement happen in that process?
Well, so for my end, what we see that companies have been very used to measuring their profits, so they're very advanced on the financial aspects. But then when we start to look at other impacts that they have, like social impacts or environmental impacts, we find multiple ways of measuring these, but it's very hard to link them to profitability. So we have several methodologies that we use if you want to evaluate, for example, the impact of companies from one sector, or if you want to mix the social and environmental measurements of just one company, or if you want to bind this information with financial aspects. And so what we're trying to work on right now, and it's actually a big question, it's something that we call the triple bottom line accounting framework. So I don't know if some of you know this methodology, but the idea is that you will take the accounting framework, like reflective framework, and apply this reflection to environmental and social impacts. But it questions the depreciation of assets, and so what are the future stranded assets, for example, and it also questions what are the impact in the future. So it's funny to see how data can provide you with a picture of the present, but also help you better understand the future and have a major impact on the policy that you're going to choose, for example. So yeah, I mean, I think we should how to say that, we should just really in the case of climate change, data is really useful for us to show evidence to companies on the way that they have to act on mitigating their impacts.
Thank you, Pauline.
Yeah,
sure. No, I got you. Who wants to jump in? Yeah, Shannon, please.
So I think about measurement as a tool in service of an outcome that we want to manage or work towards. So, it's interesting because we tend to measure things that we want to drive towards. And in my world, I'm very passionate about government performance management because I think about government working in service of the public good. However, we don't see a lot of governments measuring the public good, which begs the question, do we not want to manage that? Are we not intentionally trying to drive towards that? And so I know one of the other questions are, what are the things we don't manage? And what we find is we don't manage things that we don't want to be on the hook for. And when it comes to governmental policies, there are many things that account for the public good, not just, an initiative or a program, what the for-profit world is doing, what the nonprofit world is doing. And so that's one thing that I see. And then the other thing is that as we saw with the COVID pandemic, we had this just plethora of measurement of data. But as you know, every state, county, city had their own way of measuring and defining those measures. What actually is a COVID death, or what actually is a COVID infection, and at what point do we measure it? And it's just really interesting that it took a journalistic entity like the Atlantic to create the default way of measuring COVID stats. And so we tend to not measure things that are too cumbersome or costly or require too much coordination to create.
Those great additions, Shannon. I love, we don't want to be on the hook for something that we're going to measure. I think that's a great call. Irwin and then Marlon.
Yeah, I mean, this is, first of all, it's an honor to be with all these people. I am an outlier. I am not an expert on data in any way. I'm struck that it feels like there's a dance between the measurable and the unmeasurable, and using your fire analogy. So there's an ever widening understanding of controlling fire, of taming fire, of domesticating fire to this day, right? And if I have a 1-year-old grandchild, and watching her begin to measure, watching her begin to count, 1, 2, 3, 4, separating, measuring. This is bigger than that. This is smaller than that. This goes in here. It's this. I'd like to suggest that, not surprisingly, if we're really at the beginning of this sort of measurement game, or the drama of measuring and filtering the too muchness of reality, let's call measuring an ability to screen and filter the too muchness of reality, that we shouldn't be surprised that Esther's point, long-term doesn't seem to be as serious as short-term precision. We shouldn't be surprised, of course. That's like that's way, my granddaughter's 1. She'll be better at measuring at 6, and hopefully better at 13, and better at 50, and then really good at the end of her life when she reflects about her life, right? We shouldn't be surprised. Morgan's incredible insight of how do you measure ancestry? As someone as a 7th generation rabbi, I like how do I measure the value of that? Everybody introduces me that way very often. What does that mean? It's not worth anything, or is it worth something that's priceless? But that's the dance between the measurable and the sort of the unmeasurable. And I think keeping that in mind might allow us to be a little bit more humble about where we are at the moment. And I don't mean humble at downgrading metrics or downgrading measures, because they're so critical in allowing us to do so much, but the humility of it, so that we can keep sort of a proper dialectic or dance between the measurable and the unmeasurable.
Thank you, Irwin. Thank you. Marlon?
Yeah, I wanted to tag on to what Shannon said. I think there's a tug of war between, we're incentivized, most of the things that are incentivized, or that are incentives, we don't actually measure. And then we're incentivized by things that we can measure. And so if you can measure something, you absolutely shift the incentives of a person. Perfect example, I advise a startup called Brain Zones, which is working to link SEL, or social emotional learning, to academics. And so teachers, principals at all levels are incentivized to improve grades. They're incentivized to improve attendance, to decrease behavioral infractions. They're not incentivized to increase grit, to increase self-awareness, to increase self-control. And so when we don't measure these things, we become less effective at actually aligning with real incentives, intrinsic incentives.
I saw Esther raise your hand there. Esther, what did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to politely not disagree entirely, but put in an and. We're often incentivized by things that would terrify us if we did measure them. Like, if you start to count how much you drink or how little you sleep, and like you keep doing these, quote, long-term destructive behaviors precisely because you're not measuring them.
All right, let's go Alex and then Lianne. Alex, please.
Yeah, I'm struck by three things really. When you talk about we don't measure things we're terrified of, and we don't measure things that we don't want to be on the hook for. So the first example of that is in climate change accounting. Basically, you tend to measure on a per cap. If countries are comparing one another, they tend to measure on what are we producing, what are we emitting. They're discounting everything they import. So you get a lot of sort of arguments of like, well, why should we do anything? You know, China's the main polluter in this way, but you know, ignoring the fact that we get all our goods from China, so we just outsource responsibility for that. Sorry about it. Yeah, it has got bigger. Anyway, and
She's
the
measuring.
second thing we don't tend to measure is, yeah, and we don't tend to measure different types of greenhouse gases. So like methane is perhaps not being measured well enough. Nitrous oxide, a big emission from farming, is not really being measured properly. So that there's a lot of farmers using too much of particular types of fertilizer, which is creating this sort of, and nitrous oxide is like so much more powerful than carbon dioxide that it's really just quite alarming to even think about it. And the other example is on not wanting to be on the hook for things. So I'm head of investigative reporting for Transparency Task Force, which is a social enterprise in the UK. They're currently measuring basically victims of financial crime and their experiences of the regulator of financial crime and financial misconduct, because the regulator isn't measuring what they think. So, you know, it has to be done by an outsider, those kinds of surveys. And, you know, we don't have any money. Everyone's like a volunteer pretty much. So it's like, it's literally just the force of a whole load of different victims coming together and wanting that data to be collected. And, you know, we're going to have to be really rigorous in trying to reach out to as many groups as we can. And the final thing that I notice is that we don't really measure women's needs and women's labor. So when you were talking about fire, it reminded me immediately of an amazing documentary called Position Among the Stars, which follows 3 generations of an Indonesian family. And sort of towards the end of that, one of the younger generation that goes to the woman who lives in the village, her grandmother, I think it's grandmother or mother, brings her like a stove cooker, saying, hey, look, you don't have to collect wood every day now, you know, you can cook on this. And she gets really depressed because she's just like, but, you know, this doesn't cost me money to collect wood every day, you know. And to her, it's much more efficient to do it that way, but it's the divide between the urban thinker and the rural thinker. And it made me think about how, you know, women's labor isn't counted. So like Iceland, I think, is one of the most progressive countries around. Thank you. And they had a women's strike decades ago where all the women just went on strike. And it forced people to measure women's labor and what we contribute when we are raising children or looking after elderly relatives. Often falls on women for some reason. So yeah, all those things tend not to be measured properly. Anyway,
Brilliant. Yeah,
brilliant.
Those are great. That's great, Alex. I really appreciate that. Let's do Lianne, and then I'd love to hear from. I have a question for Ashley. Lianne.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's quite a few things that have really resonated, and I kind of I'm going to touch on a few things, but one of the things is what you mentioned, Yancey, at the beginning about self-interest. I also wanted to throw, like, what I think a lot of people have touched on here is like this idea of self-preservation as well, and the idea that you kind of have this narrative about whatever that identity is of what it is you're measuring. And if we take it on a personal level, and I think people mention things like sleep and how much you drink, and if that doesn't fit with your identity and as a person, that like maybe you have this identity that I'm a healthy person, so you'll probably discard those measures. So, but I think that self-interest and preservation happens on every single scale, and I'll just kind of bring it to kind of my area, which is like digital media. And it's that idea that we're giving content out, and then the idea is that the number of people that watch it, the attention, time spent, all those sorts of measures, other things that are very easy and observable, and it becomes that sort of behavior of people, yet we don't really understand more about what those things did for people, what the content did for a person. We're sort of more concerned about the number of people that watched it, the time they spent with it, and whether they repeated the behavior, almost like some kind of animal just keeping repeating this behavior. But we don't really understand how that fits into somebody's life, or what they did next, and whether it inspired them to go and do something really great, or we don't really have that journey beyond that sort of measure. So that was like one of the things. And then I'm going to just touch on this idea of like, we don't measure things, and the things that we do end up becoming like proxies for things that we think fit in with that narrative of that I'm a good organization, I deliver great content if it's a content organization, or even I'm a great healthy person. So the proxies become the things that end up becoming measured, but we don't really have that whole understanding of like the whole narrative around it, the whole person, the whole holistic view. So I think there I kind of noted a few things down. That's kind of just my.
That's great, Lianne. Yeah, I think calling out the proxy, the way we have our confirmation biases of what we see and don't see, I think are great to think about. Ashley, as I think about what don't we measure, just to be technical and reading some of your past work, I mean, what we don't measure are people who respond to surveys, or people who are more, who are more suspicious, perhaps. I'd love to hear sort of how you think about when Pew is doing something, how you're thinking about what you're measuring and what you're not measuring.
Sure. So in general, in survey research, we think about things as organized under the total survey error framework. And there are a lot of pieces that I won't go into, but I'll kind of summarize them by saying we think about kind of three things that are easy, right? Like Morgan said, like others have said. And number one is the population. Is the population easy to measure? Right? And that could mean that they're the general population of adults, right? So children are hard to measure because we have to get special consent. There are rare populations that are hard to find. There are people that are suspicious and so don't want to participate. And all of those things really drive costs. So we can find all of those people, we can do all of those things, but if it's too expensive, then kind of the return on investment is maybe not worthwhile for us. And that's true for any data collector. The second kind of aside from population is the concept. So we've talked about kind of self-identity, right? That's an abstract concept. How do you ask somebody, what's your self-identity? And then actually put all of the different people's perceptions together to actually tell a story and measure something. One of the things that we try to measure is social integration. So how tied to your community are you? And so we can ask questions and operationalize that as asking about, do you belong to the PTA, or do you play a group sport, or do you talk to your neighbors, or do you have family dinners, right? But if we don't operationalize that correctly, then we're not measuring the right thing. And we might have to go down too far of a rabbit hole to really make that worthwhile. And then the third group of items that are kind of harder are the sensitive things, right? The things that people are happy to talk to us, but they might not be happy to answer that specific question or provide that specific data point, or they might flat out lie. So for example, we know that people tell us they vote, even though they did not vote, right? People love to tell us they have a library card, even if it's something just that simple, right? And they like to tell us, they want to project an image that makes them seem more likely to be liked, right? And so whether or not we're getting a true answer or not is really problematic. And so I think a lot of ways that's migrated us from using surveys, right? Stop asking people when they can lie or not answer, and start using these big data or alternative data. And that's great. Except I think that gives us a false sense of security that we're getting a better product, right? And that's not necessarily true. There's error in those big data too. And I think you wrote in the email summary I got about this about how facial recognition software, and there are errors there. Google algorithms can be error. If I don't wear my Fitbit one day because I want to be lazy and I just don't want to track that information at all, right? That all introduces error properties that we need to know about. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll be quiet, I promise, is it's not necessarily a bad thing to have error or to have proxy information. It depends on what you're going to use it for and how you want it, what you need to be able to do with it. If it's close enough, then maybe spending way less money to collect something that's close enough is totally sufficient for the decisions that you need to make. Whereas other times that's not the case.
Thank you, Ashley. That was great. That was great. Such a great base of knowledge to put in the room. So I want to shift to this question of who decides what gets measured and why we measure. And I'd love to focus this starting with Übeyd and Salome, who I think have interesting directions on this. Übeyd, I'm really fascinated in the translation of like the UN Sustainable Development Goals to Islam and the translation of Islam to measurements. And so thinking about this question of who decides what gets measured and why, I think is especially interesting from your perspective. So I'd love to hear how you respond to this.
Of course, thank you for the opportunity. In short, the people holding the stick with the power set the measures, and sometimes that can have very negative implications. The person measuring is not held accountable, but the person being measured, they'll hit them. The person with the stick doesn't hit himself. And historically, in nations with Muslims and other minorities, we can look at India under the British Empire. We see that there's a power disbalance, and when Western powers come in and start defining the people and the culture, even in Alaska, when I was in the US, I did some Native American law. There's a story between how Native Americans in Alaska became shareholders. Something bad happened. You're not a citizen, you're a shareholder. What happened here? When Western powers come into places and they bring their definitions with them, they had their motivation, and that was acquiring wealth and sending it home. The motivations were not good. And so now when these Western powers who have evolved, repented in some way, and are trying to repair the societies that they trashed with the Sustainable Development Goals, you have to expect that the local population is a little suspicious. Like, oh, here we go again. The UN, which is really the US and the UK and France and Germany and Europe, is telling us to use these measures. And so my task as a policy advisor for the Islamic Reporting Initiative was to find a way for Muslim nations to understand that this is not an attempt to recolonize, that this is not evil. And the methodology we used was to show that Islamic civilization was sustainable. There was a golden age, and within Islamic scriptures in the Quran and the Hadith and numerous translations by many, many scholars, all of the Sustainable Development Goals are there. And so we spent lots of money. We found scholars to basically, at street level, explain to people, this is not new. The Sustainable Development Goals are in the Quran, and we can actually teach the UN how to do this better. We have a lot to contribute. And if you look at social media 3 years ago, 4 years ago, no one in the Muslim community was talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. After our efforts, now when you get on Facebook and LinkedIn, everyone is writing papers about this. Islam and the Sustainable Development Goals, the Maqasid al-Sharia, the priorities of Sharia, and it's this with the Sustainable Development Goals. We've changed the conversation, and it's been success because we used the local culture, the local context to show that this is not new.
Thank you, Übeyd. That's fascinating. Salome, how do you think about this of who decides what gets measured?
Yeah, I'll actually just pick up on a number of threads here. I mean, I think Übeyd articulated this so nicely. What we measure is a reflection of our larger economic and political priorities. And that often means that we measure what's profitable to measure, but more precisely, when we're talking about those collective priorities, it's not really our collective priorities, it's the priorities of those looking to maximize profit and who have already hold power. So, you know, a lot of what my thinking kind of focuses on as a legal scholar is developing legal institutions to recognize and enforce more priorities in what we measure and how we govern what's measured. And, you know, I think that changes the kinds of measurements you see. So a little bit in answer to the first question, one thing that's measured are the things that we legally mandate to measure. And that can be especially useful when we're talking about measuring things that it's not in the self-interest of the measurers to measure, the things that might be inconvenient or cumbersome, or that might, you know, sort of shift the measurement priorities away from just reflecting their own priorities and actually reflecting a far greater set of priorities. So in the case of, you know, the sustainable development goals, not just reflecting the priorities of the US and Western Europe, for instance, but like actually our global population, what would that look like? And, you know, I mean, I think that reorienting the goal to that, kind of like expanding the set of priorities that are considered legally relevant in how we govern and mandate measurement can be really useful. You know, I think about the fact that we can't really understand inequality, that it might be inconvenient for the winners of global inequality to bring to light. We don't understand that the same if you don't measure income and wealth. And that means that we need to have things like tax records. We need to have things like publicly available tax record for measurers of global inequality to be able to access and kind of articulate. We can't understand things like corporate social responsibility and actually begin to develop accountability around corporate social responsibility if we're not measuring things like global supply chains. Yeah, I guess I'll just sort of leave it at that as sort of a project of expanding and legally recognizing a far greater set of priorities.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I really appreciate about your research and writing, Salome, is that you are critical of the assumptions we currently make around measurement, but you also advocate for, actually, we should be measuring way more. There's actually, our entire way of thinking about this is quite off. Irwin, yeah, please go ahead.
I want to double down on both those last comments. There is, just my own experience, so one of the things that we're involved in my organization is helping religious leaders or faith-rooted leaders, inviting them into collaborating on measuring whether the job they actually want to get done, you can hear Clay's language, whether they're actually getting that job done. And so, for example, start out with what are the jobs that you imagine, quotation marks, in the religion sector within your particular, you can even get it down to the congregation, which is somewhat measurable in terms of cost, as Ashley, as I know from Ashley, boy, it's so true from in the work I do. Like if you actually imagine that religious practice and being in your congregation is upgrading your virtue, developing virtue or character or the qualities of human flourishing, right? Are you willing to actually use some of those tools, right, to evaluate whether the ends that you yourself claim you're for? And there's a lot of resistance to that. And, sometimes we don't want to, I mean, I know that it's funny because I'm the religious faith person on the side of measurement now, but which is a little counterintuitive, but sometimes people don't actually want to know the truth about what's happening, And we did the first project. It's going to be written up in a peer-reviewed journal in the next 3-4 months. We took 10 synagogues, right? And again, peer-reviewed, social psychologists, et cetera, and developed after a 10-day period of high-level attendance, et cetera, in the synagogue over a period in which forgiveness is a fundamental job getting done, to become more forgiving, right? And to grant forgiveness, okay? I mean, and that is, it's like, there's not like 10 other jobs. That's the biggest job to get done. and developing a survey to measure that. And then, baseline, post-base, 10 days later, 2 months later. And there was a lot, there were a lot of synagogues and a lot of leadership in that synagogue that controls access that weren't so, well, they were not interested in actually having this measured. And so there's it's almost like in some ways we prioritize, there are too small number of priorities. And I think that's what Salome is saying, like, yeah, it's too small. And in other places where we actually should be doing it, the people are scared to actually measure if something works or doesn't work.
Yeah. Shannon.
Yeah, I'd like to double down on what Irwin just said. To measure something well, you have to get super clear on what are the results that you want to drive towards. Once you get clear on those outcomes, and then you think about, well, what are all the different ways in which we can measure this? And then from there, of all the different ways, like which ones are going to give us the most impact, which are the most feasible to collect, which one's going to give us the most bang for the buck, and then really getting clear on the definition of that, and having your stakeholders, the people that you're measuring, also part of that conversation is so clutch. And just to go back to your original question around who decides what gets measured, I even think about who decides to measure at all. And it just boggles my mind that we have a 1.9 trillion stimulus package that was just passed, of which $350 billion is going to states, counties, and cities to build back better. And there are some general categories, but overall, there are no measurements. There's no outcomes. What do we know? How will we know when we have built back better? What are the goals that we're aiming towards? How will we know when we're tracking? And right now, without those measures, it's very likely that that funding is just going to go through the leaky bucket that we know many like state, county, and city governments tend to be, instead of building a better bucket and using measurements to know whether we're trending in that direction.
But Esther, go ahead.
It's true, we're throwing out money, but for better or worse, the communities, the counties, they are measuring stuff. If we started to have a discussion in Congress about what we're going to measure and the outcomes, I think it would slow. I agree with you in theory, but in practice, I think, you can have the Soviet Union with an input-output chart, and everybody will start lying about what they've achieved. Or you can give the community the money, and the community will, it's a mess. I don't want to say there's any perfect solution, but I would also say that the fact that we don't have a measurement protocol fully set up shouldn't stop us from taking action. And it's a dynamic tension there and worth discussing.
For sure.
We'll do Lianne and then Salome and Alex.
Yeah, just picking up on that idea of like not measuring, I think inherently, if you bring it back to like why, because I think it's such a great question, like why on earth do we even measure anything to begin with? But then if you kind of take that even further back, you kind of think, well, actually, it's really ingrained in us as people from that psychological perspective that you just like everybody wants to, if you look at all the models of human needs and all that kind of thing, we just need to understand and need to feel like we're competent in life and that we're doing a good job. And we have all these really deep needs that are just ingrained in us to measure ourselves in some capacity, whether we're doing it overtly or unovertly, and then also on a kind of wider scale and sort of company-wide, organization, government-wide scale. It's that, again, it comes back to identity. It's this, does that fit in with the narrative of the identity of the government or whoever, like yourself? And it just, if you scale it back, I just love the idea of like scaling it back to say, okay, well, why are we measuring what we're measuring? Actually, why, going back one stage further, like why are we even measuring? And then going back one stage further, like actually it all links back down to our really like core human values of just showing that we're competent in life and that we have identity tied to that. There's just so much rich history around all of those needs that we have to show we're kind of progressing in life. It's kind of just ingrained in us. And that's just
thank you, Lianne. We'll go Salome, Alex. I see you, Irwin. Salome next.
I think just to respond, I think to Shannon's really interesting and provocative point about the stimulus package. I mean, I tend to approach measurement and the operationalization of measurement as like sort of a political exercise, and it's going to be reflecting political goals, like what visions of the good we want to achieve. And, part of the ambiguity in that package may reflect some, socially beneficial plurality. We may think that municipalities are better situated to think about and recognize the relevant interests in the measurement that they need to do to build back better. Building back better may look, I'm in Ann Arbor, build back better may look different in Ann Arbor than it does in New York City, than it does in New Orleans. And, as a legal scholar, again, I think about, issues of federalism. We may want to build in some ambiguity there, but, we're certainly also probably fudging over, deep political divides and just sort of leaving it sort of deliberately vague in order to sort of realize that the practicalities of getting legislation passed. So I just want to say that there's the potential for sort of both readings of that ambiguity in there.
Thanks, Salome. Alex?
So I think there was a really interesting discussion I was in the other day where Steve Keen, the author of Debunking Economics, was asked about measurement, and he sort of lost his temper and said measurement is an excuse not to do anything, and he was talking about climate. But I think it sort of depends on culture and incentives. It depends on the reason you're measuring. People should be measuring incentives. I mean, with climate, what I've written about quite a bit and been following closely is the campaign against wood chip biomass, because of it being basically a loophole by which to avoid counting the emissions from stuff we're burning. And that's just, Drax Power Station in the UK is like the biggest wood burner in the world. So that's like, it's kind of why I've been aware of it. But that's a classic example of people moving in a certain direction because the incentive is there precisely because it's not being measured properly, but that's creating an incentive to add a loophole. If you fix the incentives, you fix the culture, and then you'll be measuring the right things for the right reasons. I think that's probably how it works.
Yeah, that incentives, focusing on the incentive, zooming in on that, I think is very smart, Alex. I would love to move to the next question about what's the impact and what are the implications of being measured? Do we think measurement is a form of control, or how do we reflect on that? I'm interested in maybe starting with hearing from Marlon and Ashley on this. Marlon, because he has an app that has like a Tinder-like UI for responding to surveys, and it's making it fun. I'd love to hear what do you think about the act of being measured, Marlon? What is your philosophy or thinking here?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that go into safely measuring and wanting to. If we go back to that incentives kind of response that Alex had, effectively you have to want to be measured when it's something that's direct, and so we try to make it something that's fun, but we also maintain anonymity and a few other things just to make sure that it's like, this is something that I want to do, right? Like, I think when I look at traditional surveys, a lot of times, at least for Gen Z, you just, like, I don't want to fill that out, right? I'm not incentivized to give my opinion or give my thoughts on something. And yet I have a lot of thoughts on this thing and I'd love to share them, but I don't want them to attribute it to me. I don't want it to feel like it's a waste of my time. I do want to feel like there's a high value add to this. And so we do a few things to incentivize, but also to, rather than extrinsically incentivize, to try to align the incentives, the intrinsic incentive, with what we're doing in order to make that the best possible outcome.
So it's like you're trying to create you're want people to opt in, and then you're building trust. You're saying, kind of in the questions you're trying to ask, where you are saying like, you are in a safe place to share what you feel here, essentially.
Exactly. Like this week is Weed Week, so because 420 just passed, and we're asking some pretty sensitive questions. But because we've built up a lot of trust over time, people have no trouble answering them, and in fact joking about them and having fun with it. So it's been enlightening to learn, I guess, just about how people share and when they share and when they feel comfortable to share, versus we've seen a lot more skips, I'd say, on certain questions than we typically do, for instance.
Well, Ashley got at this a minute before about people not being honest on surveys. So that shows there's some, like, the act of being measured or being asked in an official way triggers something for us. How do you all think about that, Ashley, with Pew, of like the effect of being surveyed on people? Like, how do you account for that?
Sure. So a lot of our data at Pew, at least our domestic data, is collected through our American Trends panel. So we've invited about 13,000 people to respond to surveys about every other week. And one of the big concerns we were worried about was that we were causing what's called panel conditioning, right? We're changing their behavior just by their inclusion. And that could be as little as something like, you didn't know who Nancy Pelosi was before, and now we asked you about what your opinion is, and now you have to go and learn about them, and that makes you more politically engaged. But it could also mean that you become more self-aware about yourself and then change your behavior. So we asked a lot of questions about news consumption and where you get your news, how much you consume. And so by thinking through that a little bit more, you might be, oh, I really need to watch less television. I need to watch more news. I need to do X, Y, and Z. And so what we found is that that's actually not a problem for us. And that's a good thing. So we're not changing a lot of people's behaviors and attitudes. But I think in general, any kind of measurement can make you more self-aware, and that can have a positive effect, right? So if I wear my Fitbit and I realize I'm not getting in all the steps, that makes me more active. Or it can actually cause more depression, right? I'm not living up to the things that I thought about myself, and now I realize that my self-identity is really harmed by that. And that can be true of corporations, et cetera, too. The other thing I think about is the privacy concerns, right? So anytime we collect more and more data, we have to be worried about, well, I'm not saying your name in this data set, but if you've identified as being non-binary, and I now release that variable, and now it's probably more likely that I could identify you in my data set. And so that's something that we think a lot about in terms of privacy rules before we release our data. And then the last thing I would say is people's perception on whether or not what they're participating in is worthwhile. So for example, there are a lot of populations that tend to be over surveyed, right? And if they don't see policy change or change in their own lives or their neighbors as a result of their participation, then they start to lose faith that the system's working, right? And they stop participating. And we find that a lot with the Native American population. So we found that survey data collectors are getting less and less privileges to get on reservation land, because when we do these surveys, the policy changes aren't happening, right? And so it's less worthwhile for them to participate, and that's hurtful across the board because it then perpetuates a cycle.
Does anyone have any reflections on being measured? Say not, or being observed? Any experiences anyone thinks about with this? Yeah, Alex, yeah.
It just reminds me that we had the census here recently where they collect data on everyone. And my grandparents are in their 90s, and like my grandmother's like half blind, and my granddad is like, so they're very sort of affected. But they're both from Yorkshire and very stoical. So when it came to the question about health, It was like, it was an option of like, how would you rate your health? And they'd be like, fair. And then it's like, oh, so do you have any conditions that will affect you for the next 6 months? Like, a list as long as your arm. But they still reckon their health is fair. So it definitely really depends where you come from and whether it's kind of a stoical kind of culture, especially when people are talking about health measurements and those kinds of things.
Esther? Yeah.
Which is why it's often so much more useful to measure changes than try to do absolutes. The only other story I have is we wanted to measure obesity rates in school children in one of our communities, and the schools didn't want to be measured. I mean, there's a lot of shame and stigma about so many things that people measure, and the very fact of not measuring them makes them more shameful, and it creates this sort of continuing downward spiral.
I'd love to combine. Oh, Irwin, sorry, go ahead.
This is where, again, there's a reason we're talking about measurement altogether, right? This conversation is embedded in a whole set of larger issues, which is why Nancy went right to fire. I mean, how could it be bigger than that? We're really saying there's something that we're all feeling that's emerging regarding some next iteration of understanding being human. We have this sort of feeling about that, and we kind of know that our ability to be better at measuring is somehow related to that, and like fire is related to improvement, and we sort of have that feeling. But not surprisingly, it's very hard to measure the emergent, and like measuring the emergent is a lot more difficult than measuring a phase change, some sort of change. So that's one. And the second is we're also doing this in the context of tremendous amount of erosion of trust. And the erosion of trust, we can call that part of the polarization. We call that the partisanship. Not to blame it, but there's an erosion of trust for a whole set of reasons. Makes any sort of measuring, it seems to me, ever more complicated, and it makes everyone suspicious that all types of measurements are becoming ends to plunge in rather than means to actually help us flourish as human beings.
So I'd love to transition to our last. I'm going to combine our last two questions into one. So I think they're very related. And the questions were, what are the do's and don'ts of measuring a trait or value well? And then what are values or qualities we could measure but do not? And I'd love to start this with Übeyd, because Übeyd, in a conversation we had offline, you talked about fairness being something like a core value to be measured within Islam. And there's a thought of like, how do we measure things like that? So I wanted to start there.
Right. Again, with do's and don'ts, I would say first get the person's permission. A lot of times when my wife's family is Palestinian in Gaza, a lot of times when caravans or delegations come in, the people in Gaza feel like they are misery tourism. Basically, the people are there to observe and to leave, maybe eat some food and leave. They're not. So many times in these studies, Muslims, Arabs especially, are treated as being observed but not participants. So they can't participate in the study. They can't be the researchers. They are the researched, and this is very problematic. One group that's been very good in changing this is Oxfam, where when they go into Palestine, they hire locals, train them, and the locals go around and ask questions to get accurate information. In terms of looking back to history, there was a Islamic scholar, statesman. Basically, there was a period of time in Islam where they looked at numbers very carefully with arithmetic, numbers in relation to each other, numbers in time, this is music, numbers in space, geometry, numbers in time and space, astronomy. And at my university and others, we're blessed, we have manuscripts, 110 million manuscripts in Turkish government from the Ottoman Empire archives. And we were looking at the question, how did they measure interactions between people? There's numbers on everything. Scholars were looking at this, and so there was a a man, Al-Mawardi, that he used the measure of fairness. And we found this very interesting because this is what people in 2020, all of these protests is happening now, and people are on the street demanding justice, they're demanding fairness. And yet 1400 years ago, we saw the same thing, that scholars came to this realization: when you are measuring people, don't use numbers, but try to use the measure of fairness and ask people, is your leader good? Is he not good? Do you know what's happening? Are leaders being held accountable? This was encapsulated into the one word, caliph, the Khalifa. You are a steward, you are responsible. It's a good word. It's not like the Islamic State's caliphate. Being called a Khalifa is a good thing. You are responsible for what you have been given, and we need to go back to this.
Morgan, what do you think about this, about values, behaviors, and qualities we could measure but do not? You talked about some of the traditions that you're trying to draw from and bring into the context. We've talked about you making a 100-year business plan. So like what are like at the edges of what you're trying to do but say can't quite do, or the bridge you're trying to make?
Yeah, just thinking about that last comment about fairness, still ringing around in my head. It is so interesting to look back to see what has been accomplished and see how we could rediscover our own history to see how it applies today. I do get a sense through this conversation that, as we've stated, we can't help but measure. We, like Lianne was saying, we need to see progress as people. Progress is happiness, right? But I wonder if there's a collectively that could be, fine, that'll go on. But as individuals, it may be all too much. I don't know how much measurement you can all take as individuals. I mean, we probably not need to measure so much, right? Or we just know enough instinctively, intuitively, inherently, in regards to our journey through life, that we may not need to know every single measurement out there. Yeah, that's kind of the thought I'm getting through this conversation. So what we may need to do, Yancey, is just take away measurement and be okay with not measuring. And we have a hard time measuring, or what are those things that don't change that are fine? Well, I was just thinking of an example. Recently, there was a carbon credit sale for in the southern United States for trees to be paid for not cutting the trees down, right? And that's been going on, this carbon credit exchange. But I think the most recent sale came about because a company got better at measuring, right? Businesses, it's all about data, right? And but they're getting paid for not doing something. So how do we measure not doing something, right? That's another form of, it's a new area where we need to say there's importance and value in not doing something.
Absolutely.
We don't put much importance on not doing something, right? You always got to be doing something. Show me your progress. And then my progress was I decided to not do anything on that. Are you sure? So anyway, those are my thoughts. I'm sorry, I didn't quite address your other question, but I needed to kind of.
No, I appreciate that, Morgan.
Sum up my thoughts on this.
Yeah, we'll go to Pauline and then Esther. But just the two things both you and Übeyd said. Not measuring, the value of not measuring, or the value of not doing something. Value of not doing something, probably always undervalues the value of not doing something. And then also Übeyd, talking about, as I think about behaviors, qualities we could measure but do not, it makes me think about bottoms up measurement in the sense of, what do people themselves want to measure about their lives and have other people have to be accountable to, versus the other way around? And how is that dynamic achievable? But let's go to Pauline. Pauline?
Yeah, so I've been reflecting on everything that everybody has said, and we've talked about people being controlled by measurement. We've been talking about measuring and over measuring or not measuring, measuring not in the right way. And I think there's something that I would like to add, which is we probably need to measure, but with purpose and with ethics. And I think that's intimately the way that we can use measurements in a useful way. So for example, I've talked earlier about climate change, but I've also worked into the social business sector. And for social businesses, it's very important for them to do social impact assessments because sometimes they have programs that don't really touch the beneficiaries that they want to reach. And I think that's also maybe something that Esther Dyson and Abhijit Amenergy, I don't remember his name, but anyway, the two guys that won the Nobel Prize in economics for the random controlled trials were intrinsically trying to do. They were trying to measure something with purpose, with the idea of improving economic policies and social policies in the country. So yeah, so that was my comment in the way that I kind of wanted to nuance a little bit what Morgan has said. I think it's good to avoid measuring too much, but it's also good to remind yourself on why you're measuring and what do you want to achieve with this measurement. And that relates to me with purpose, like the purpose of measuring.
Thank you, Pauline. Esther, you were going to say something?
Yeah, just very briefly on measuring, not doing something. The science of counterfactuals and our ability to predict what is likely to happen versus what did happen makes it easier to measure the impact of things you don't do. And yeah, that's just something to keep in mind. Because the rest of the world is measured, we can more easily predict the effect of your non-action.
Maybe I'm going to open it up to everyone, to the wider room here. I just want to maybe push on this question of values and things that we can measure but do not, and maybe also this question of bottoms up kind of measurement. Does anyone have anything there? Irwin?
I'm struck by this last round, and I'm struck by Übeyd specifically. One of the things that we know in our traditions is that tools are actually sacred. In other words, they're not we think of tool as utilitarian, but it's not. Tools are actually sacred, and they have to be treated with respect, whether it's a grandfather's hammer, whether it is something in a temple, the tools now. And so I think there's something about us beginning to think about humility and awe and reverence around what we call these measurement tools. And bringing that kind of reverence might allow us to use them a little differently. And I thought that's one point. Second point, and that's a humility point. The second is this collaborative nature of measuring your bottoms up. I hope this won't go beyond here too much because I can get in trouble. I have been in a very significant and very uncomfortable, I don't know what to call it, disagreement regarding the sort of gross national happiness measure on Israel, because Israel comes out as very, very, very high. And it's a funky measurement that you can measure high. Now, I'm a 7th generation rabbi. I am a proud member of the Jewish people. It's very funky measurement that you can come out and score a society amongst the highest, who's the first or second in the world, and at the same time have significant problems in oppressing people. Okay, and I'm not making a political statement there. I'm making just a descriptive statement of on the ground reality. That means that there's something off about the collaborative nature of how we measure. And that leads, my last point is being able to really distinguish means and ends here. In the end, it's so easy to turn measures into ends and to always be aware that they are sacred means, but they're just means. And unless they're always weighed against wider perspectives, more diverse interests, and just being one tool in the learning process, we'll wind up with the classic thing that Übeyd and I worry about, which is just another form of idolatry in the world.
Thank you, Irwin. So this Yeah, and anything else on bottoms up or other things to be measured or other things that are coming alive for people? Alex, please.
Yeah, just very briefly, the term grassroots regulation is one I've been hearing a lot. I think it originated from an academic called Shannon Turnbull. But yeah, I believe it came from him. He thinks that that will fix a lot of things if there can be a system for grassroots regulation instead of sort of top-down regulation of big business.
Okay, well, I'd like to just open up for everyone. Everyone who's here can turn on your video. And here, Mario, I see Mario, you brought yourself on video and you have a comment here on bottoms up. Do you want to join the conversation and share what you were thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everybody for this. Really enjoyed this. Around bottom up, I think a lot about that a lot because especially when you look at social media regulation, all the debate that's happening right now around the internet and Section 230 in the US, there's a lot of top down, obviously, like how are we dealing with this? How are we measuring it? What's correct? What's not? And it seems to paper over the fact that a lot of the issues are actually at the user experience level. And so I generally find this idea of measurement to be most effective when we go bottom up and try to incentivize people as people, not with these abstract notions that they can't attach their emotions to and their motivations to. And so if we can change things at kind of that atomic unit level and measure there, or at the very least go in both directions, I think there's a major flaw in a lot of the top down because you can't engage people properly.
Thank you, Mario. Anyone want to respond to that? I think it's a great point. Jennifer, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I don't necessarily have it's not really a question, but I'm an MBA student and I kind of was reflecting through this whole conversation about the permanence of what we measure. And specifically, I've been thinking a lot about my grades and, you know, what they actually mean and are they a reflection of my effort? You know, when I was a kid, my mom asked, you know, is this the kind of B that could have been an A, or is this the kind of B that you're actually proud of? And, you know, your GPA is the same, the B is the same. It's, you know, permanent on that record, but it doesn't have any sort of larger picture or reflection of that bottoms up idea. So yeah, I just have been thinking about that.
Thank you. Who else has a question? Brooke, I saw you raise your hand. Did you have a question, Brooke?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, Alex, for the work you do. I just resonated a lot with what you said with like the legal implications of like financial inequality. And oh no, Salome was saying that, but I liked what Alex was saying too. But Salome, what you're doing is really good work. So thank you.
Very nice. Cecilia, do you want to ask what your question here?
I wanted to make a couple of comments from all the discussions that were brought up. I really appreciate the things that Ashley was saying and Shannon, and the idea of the invitation to be measured is definitely heavily curated, which talks about the top-down thing. It's like, oh, we want to measure this group of people, so let's just call who we know in this group of people, and that's all we'll measure. Where the question might change and shift if we were to open up to a wider swath of people, because you're actually curating not only what's measured, but who's being asked, right? So, and then the idea of what Marlon was talking about the influences, and I think about the lack of trust being around. There's a hinge that says, you know, if you give me this information, we will have this information. Great, yay you. It's like, okay, I just gave you my information. Like, what do I get out of it? Do I ever get to use it for anything? Like, I was part of a survey, and you know what? This is what came up without. So it's more of a relational thing, which I really appreciate. Like Mario's app on his website on Redocracy, I get to find out what I read and the information that I'm consuming. And so I get something out of it. Meanwhile, Mario gets something out of it because he gets the data of the things that are being read, right? So there's a relationship that we build there. So I don't know that I necessarily want to be incentivized, but I'd like to know, hey, so with this information, what are we going to be done? And I've been in a summit about, so my question, which I don't know that there's an answer to, is even with things like SROI, when you talk about the social return on investment in that realm doesn't necessarily translate to finance, right? You're actually investing, like action and whatever, but we still measure it in monetary terms. Is there a way to get past how we equate value with monetization, and where you talk about the fairness and the value of what did you do with, I love that, responsible for what you've been given, like what did you do with the stuff that you got, which I think is a wholly valuable thing. So that was a lot for me.
Yeah, that's a big question, Cecilia, that I will put a pin in that question, but I would love to, the data questions. Salome, do you want to talk about data trusts? I feel like a data trust might be an interesting concept to introduce. It's just a different way of thinking about it.
Yeah, sure. It's also a nice tie-in to something that Mario raised. It sounds trite, but it's helpful to remember that democracy as like a normative political theory is all about closing the circle between bottom up and top down. So we live in a world where we think there are these really stark divides between that, but a lot of that is because in a lot of the institutions that govern our lives, we are not living in democratic institutions. And in a way, we're like so intimately familiar with the idea that we like live in democracies that we forget that that's actually like a very powerful political philosophy that doesn't just mean like voting every 4 years. It means like we are both the bottom, we set the agenda for the top, which in turn places mutual obligations on all of us at the bottom. So just sort of bringing that back into the conversation as a segue to data trusts, which are institutions that really do try to legally, formally represent far greater numbers of interests of people who might have a stake in how information is being used about them in setting kind of the purposes and the limitations and the goals that determine how information is collected, processed, used, and shared. They can take a variety of forms. Like all old legal instruments, they're very flexible. So it depends on who's putting data trusts into play and how they're setting them up. They can be good or bad, but as a general kind of innovation, they're potentially a really nice, promising way to kind of insert an intermediary between data subjects and data collectors, and to try to collectivize all of the interests of data subjects and try to kind of meaningfully manage that information with this idea of stewardship. Trusts have to be managed with the best interests of the trust beneficiaries, which might be data subjects in this regard, and can kind of offer one way to again reflect a broader set of values that aren't just financial values, but also kind of the best interests of the trust beneficiaries.
And it's a somewhat more equal power relationship in that it is, a group representing rather than individuals. So
yeah. And again, they're kind of collective power, individual power to meet kind of the unequal power relationships that we're otherwise in bilaterally.
Yeah, I think that will be a tool that we will likely see more of. I see there are great questions to talk to. Amanda, you had your hand up a while ago. Would you like to share what you're going to have to say?
Sure. Just one thing that occurred to me, and thank you so much for this conversation. It's really enlightening for me. Just one thing that sprung to mind was a reflection back to the earliest part of the conversation and thinking about grassroots measurement is just wanting to be mindful about how do we bring some consistency over the long term, because we don't just want to be short-term impact focused. And I was really inspired by what Morgan was talking about the past and how do we make sure that we are reflecting kind of more foundational values in what we're choosing to measure going forward. So it's just an open question for me is how do we create consistency? And I think also some cohesion and some interconnectedness between all of these diverse data sets that people are building out there and collect them around something that feels more long-term oriented.
And maybe Lisa, you have a great question. You want to share yours that I feel like really builds on what Amanda was saying there too, if you're still in the room, Lisa. But Lisa's asking about statistical literacy. Oh, is that you, Lisa?
Yeah. Hi. How are you?
Great.
Sorry about that. Yeah. How can we prioritize statistical literacy for our kids' education. I mean, I haven't used algebra maybe ever, but I'm not that good at statistical literacy. It's daunting for me because I didn't learn it from a young age. And it seems like the more data we collect, the more urgent the need is for everyone in our society, but specifically kids growing up with more and more and more data to understand it.
Does anyone have a recommendation that they think of for like the good,
I have something on that, Yancey.
Morgan? Oh, and then Übeyd. Morgan and Übeyd, yeah.
Whoever can communicate the data better and make it more relevant to the person will win, right? So that's a huge area she tapped into there. There's going to be so much data. It's those folks who want to influence others, how they take that data, turn it into a story, a narrative, because that's how our brains will structure information. Who can tell the best story using that data? You go back to Inconvenient Truth, that was a bunch of slides, right? Took that data, turned it into a story, it had impact. So that'll be the next section here too, is who can do the best storytelling with the data and will have the most impact. That didn't answer the question, but I kind of thought that.
No, that's a great question. Great answer, Morgan, and something that needed to be said. Übeyd.
I think that eventually children will be doing statistics better than all of us. That's good. However, the director of the FBI a few weeks ago, he had an open meeting with Brookings Institute that I participated in, and he talked about after the Soviet Union put up the Sputnik satellite, there was a shift in US education to STEM. And a negative effect of that was that social sciences were ignored, and it created a generation of Americans that can't disagree professionally. They don't understand government. And now the FBI has identified as a national security threat, and a strategic imperative is to reteach civics. And so I would say, yes, we need to emphasize statistics, but before that, teach ethics, leadership, some character before you teach children how they can use and lie with statistics.
Excellent. So let's have Jennifer and Mario, and then we'll start to wrap up. Jennifer, what do you have to say?
Yeah, I was just wondering what the panel's thoughts might be on measuring these kind of soft skills that are really urgently needed in the world right now to solve some pressing problems like problem solving or conflict resolution. We can measure these hard numbers, but I guess I'm wondering how do we create a concept around these things that's shared so that we understand the need for it and then measure that in a way that makes it easier for people to respond to that or apply public pressure.
I'd love to hear, great question, Jennifer. I'd love to hear Lianne, Ashley, or Shannon. You all sort of do this professionally, so I'd love to hear your response to that.
I can talk about kind of some more soft type of things that we're measuring. One of the things that I'm doing at the moment is, so I work in digital media, and at the moment we measure through attention, and it's that hard sort of stats, hard numbers. And a lot of my role in the last 3 years has been to almost re-educate people to say, take a step back and question why, what's the intention, what's the outcome, and then it's been a lot of sort of grassroots effort. But I'd say the big thing with what I've been doing to even get to a point where I've been sort of taken seriously and actually been able to run a project where we're starting to measure what we term as human values. Now, I am putting air quotes around that because obviously value means different things to different people, and we've done years worth of research around language as well, because it's just so culturally appropriate. There's just so many different connotations. You've got legacy, lots of things coming in through. But one of the big things is has been educating and actually educated in the sense of showing what you can provide, like what the positive is if you move from that hard number to measuring something quite differently. So I don't have a specific answer for your specific question about actually measuring soft skills, but what I would say is like the process that I and my team have been through has been a lot around kind of talking to different people who have those like very hard opinions about things and showing them at first it's about, oh look, if we still measure what you're measuring, but what if we had a complementary measure? And then it's the idea is then you can start moving towards, oh, actually I want to understand a little bit more about that complementary measure, and actually maybe that is more sustainable, because one of the big things that I've come across is that they say we want more numbers and we want more time, and I say but you've caught the UK, you've got the whole UK population, where are you going to go from there? There's no sustainability in that. So it's, I don't know if that helps in terms of just the process of taking people on that journey. And I think the narrative around it is just so important, probably the most important thing, I think, and showing people not what they should stop doing, but maybe almost start moving towards and what they would gain from it, because people always want to know what they'll gain from understanding that thing.
Thank you, Lianne. Shannon, how do you think about this?
So in my work, we measure things like psychological safety and trust within organizations. And the most effective way that we've found to measure this is to actually have the people who are engaged in the behaviors measure themselves. And so we ask them things like, how often do you acknowledge the strengths and skills in your colleagues? Rarely, sometimes, or regularly. And then we bring that data back to them and we say, isn't this interesting? We found that of your team, you do this pretty rarely. What do we want to do about that? And then we get them involved in the actual change in the behavior. And then we measure it again 3 months later. We say, like, how are we doing? So just wanted to throw that in there, especially when it comes to micro level behaviors. Having the people involved in the behavior adjustment themselves is a really effective way.
Great addition, Shannon. Ashley, when you're trying to measure the intangible, what is the methodology? How do you do that and have some confidence in what you're doing?
So, I mean, I will say that I've never tried to measure soft skills, right? So I have to talk about this from a general concept of the abstract. And I think there are a couple things. Number one is plagiarism's a good thing in measurement. So if you can find a measure that's already been validated, go for it. And I think that Marlon has posted a couple examples of other places in the chat about what are good measures of soft skills. And I think that just helps with validity, it helps with replication, it helps with a whole bunch of concepts. The second thing I'd say is if there aren't previously created measures, it takes a lot and it's worthwhile to create some. And you can, if you think about this from a statistics perspective and use kind of structural equation models, and there are a whole bunch of math and we could go down a path for days. But to really make sure that what you think you're measuring is what you are measuring is really, really critical. And then the last thing I'd say is, why do you think those things are important? So is it because there's greater efficiency, there's a higher retention rates, there's better employee satisfaction? Like, what are your outcomes? And if you have, a program to train these kind of skills, or you've changed your hiring mechanisms to hire people that have these kinds of skills, to measure those outcomes over time, controlling for other factors, I think will go a long way in figuring out really how effective they are and whether or not you're succeeding in getting those kind of people.
That was great. That was great, Ashley. Does anyone have anything they feel a burning desire to share? Mario, you had your hand up again. Was that for another question? Yeah, go ahead, Mario.
Just want to quickly add, and also Lianne, you have all my respect after spending 2 years trying to convince newsrooms to measure differently and how they think about that. So a lot of respect for that. Just around, Jennifer Long had mentioned regarding her MBA and, you know, measuring that and what education means and how we measure all that. I just thought it was interesting in the context of the permanence and longevity of data, in the context of how sometimes we measure things and they actually pigeonhole us as they become stale. So what does your degree say about you 20 years out? And I just think that's really interesting from a general data conversation perspective and how we measure things, and do they evolve or do they get stuck? And also obviously in the conversation of AI, where old data sets that were obviously biased are being used as foundational and only now starting to get questioned. So I think it's just that particular point of permanence and longevity, I think is really important.
Great one, Mario, great one. I'm gonna ask once again, does anyone have anything that's like lighting a fire inside you to share? Alex, yes, please.
Yeah, just very quickly, I was thinking about trust from various points that have come up in the conversation, and it crystallized the thought to me that basically we need to let go of the past a little bit and address the past, because a lot of the lack of trust in people collecting data on you is culturally to do with the history of like the British Empire and the way that people historically were analyzed in order to try and control them better. And that's kind of the legacy that kind of has to be dealt with culturally around data. And it's based on a friend basically was doing theatre projects with the Windrush generation, who are have been quite oppressed in the UK. And the level of trust was at like 0. You know, nobody wanted to give any data whatsoever because they did not trust authority at all. So that toxic legacy is right there.
Well, I would want to thank each of you. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Irwin. Thank you, Pauline. Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Marlon. Thank you, Salome. Thank you, Übeyd. Thank you, Shannon. And thank you to all of our guests, to Lianne. I'm very happy with our conversation. And I feel like from all these different perspectives, there are a lot of things that resonated. And there are definitely several things I've learned and taken away from this discussion together. We will do another one of these roundtables again in a few months, but these to me have just been fantastic for getting to a deeper understanding of a really thorny topic that's kind of, we're so immersed in, it's hard to get a lot of perspective on. So for me, hearing from your brilliance and your experience is helping me get a better sense of the picture. And for that, I'm very grateful.